And I had a record called What It Was Football.
Sure.
And Ed Sullivan wanted to sign me up for, I think it was 18 shots.
For 8 seasons, Andy Griffith played the most trustworthy man on television. Sheriff Andy Taylor never raised his voice, never carried a gun, and never lied. But off-screen, the man behind Mayberry was living a very different story. He died in 2012, but it took years, a tell-all book, and a small army of former crew members to finally drag the truth about his marriage and his leading lady out of the shadows. Here is what really happened. The sheriff who never lied. Before he was Sheriff Andy Taylor, Andy Griffith was just a preacher's kid turned choir boy from a small mill town. He was born June 1st, 1926, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, the only child of Carl Lee Griffith and his wife Geneva. As a kid, he sang and played slide trombone in the band at his local church, and for a while he genuinely considered a career in the ministry. He went on to study at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and after graduating, took a job teaching high school music in Goldsboro, about as far from Hollywood as a career path could get. His break into performing came through an outdoor pageant called The Lost Colony, staged in Manteo, North Carolina, where he played the role of Sir Walter Raleigh. That pageant would end up shaping the rest of his life in more ways than one. Decades later, long after fame had made him a household name, Griffith chose to settle down permanently in Manteo rather than Los Angeles or New York. And by most accounts, he guarded his privacy there fiercely. Friends recalled that when strangers asked locals where Griffith lived, they'd get vague, circular directions that conveniently led nowhere near his actual house. Everybody loved Andy Taylor. He was patient with Opie, gentle with Barney, and about as wholesome as television got. Millions of families tuned in every week, believing they were watching a decent, uncomplicated man. Andy Griffith built that image so well that most people never questioned it. He was already a star before Mayberry, thanks to his breakout film role in A Face in the Crowd and his comedy record What It Was Football. But it was Sheriff Andy Taylor who made him a household name. Griffith was born in 1926 in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and that same small town became the blueprint for Mayberry itself. It wasn't invented out of thin air. It was modeled after Griffith's own hometown, right down to the small-town rhythms and the nosy neighbors, and fans still visit Mount Airy today, looking for pieces of the fictional town they grew up watching. Griffith later reflected on why the character worked so well, explaining in an interview that Andy Taylor represented the best parts of himself, while insisting there were other sides to him the cameras never captured. At the time, most viewers assumed that was just modesty. Looking back, it reads a little differently. The show didn't even start as its own idea. It began as a backdoor pilot episode on The Danny Thomas Show in 1960, designed specifically to test whether audiences would follow Griffith into his own series. They did, in huge numbers, and The Andy Griffith Show premiered later that same year on CBS. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The show's biggest breakout star almost wasn't Griffith at all. So who actually stole the spotlight in Mayberry? Don Knotts arrived on set to play Deputy Barney Fife, and almost overnight, he became the emotional center of the show. Griffith himself recognized it early. In an interview with the Television Academy, he admitted that once he realized how good Knotts was at physical comedy, he deliberately stepped back and let himself play the straight man. That single decision reshaped the entire series. Andy became the calm anchor, and every eccentric character around him, starting with Barney, got to be the comic engine. It worked. The show ran for 8 full seasons and, remarkably, went off the air in 1968, while it was still the #1 rated program on television. A feat shared by only a handful of shows in history, including I Love Lucy and later Seinfeld. Rather than disappearing, the world of Mayberry simply continued in a spin-off called Mayberry RFD, with Griffith staying on as executive producer. The bond between Griffith and Knotts turned out to be one of the realest relationships to come out of Mayberry. And unlike the alleged affair with Corsaut, this one Griffith actually talked about openly. In an interview given in January of 2000, Griffith said flatly that the 5 years he spent working alongside Knotts were the best 5 years of his life. Knotts left the regular cast in 1965, but kept returning for guest appearances for years afterward, and the two men stayed close for the rest of their lives. When Knotts was dying of lung cancer in early 2006, Griffith made the trip from his home in Manteo all the way to Los Angeles just to sit with his old friend at Cedars-Sinai before he passed. The show clearly had its formula figured out professionally. So why did Griffith struggle so badly with something as simple as on-screen romance? The sheriff who couldn't flirt. For a man who radiated confidence on screen, Andy Griffith reportedly had a genuinely hard time selling romantic chemistry in his early seasons. He went on record with the Associated Press in 1964 admitting exactly that, saying he wanted his on-screen courtship to develop slowly rather than rushing into anything overtly romantic. There's one famous story from behind the scenes that captures just how uncomfortable he was. During the filming of a romantic scene outside the sheriff's office, Griffith was supposed to lean in for a kiss. Instead, he pulled back at the last second and told the director the moment felt wrong for a conservative small-town sheriff. His suggestion instead was to have Barney interrupt the moment entirely, turning an awkward romantic beat into a comedic one. The director agreed, and the scene was reshaped on the spot. For years, Andy Taylor dated around Mayberry without ever settling down. His first serious on-screen love interest was Ellie Walker, the town's pharmacist, played by actress Eleanor Donahue. Ellie was smart and independent, but the character left the show after just one season when Donahue chose not to renew her contract, and Mayberry needed a new leading lady fast. That's when Peggy McMillan briefly stepped in, played by Joanna Moore. Peggy lasted a little longer than Ellie, but writers never quite figured out how to make her chemistry with Andy click the way audiences wanted. Neither relationship had staying power, and both actresses eventually moved on from the show entirely. Looking back, it's almost as if the writers themselves knew something was missing, cycling through leading ladies until they stumbled onto whatever it was that made Corsaut different. Then everything changed when one woman walked onto the set. The teacher who changed everything. Aneta Corsaut showed up in 1963 to film a single episode, playing a schoolteacher named Helen Crump, Opie's teacher. She was only ever meant to appear that one time, but producers noticed something immediately. The chemistry between Corsaut and Griffith on screen was completely different from anything the show had captured before. Instead of writing her off after one appearance, they brought her back, and back again, until Helen Crump became a permanent fixture in Mayberry. Unlike Andy's previous love interests, Helen wasn't written as someone who needed rescuing. She challenged him, questioned his decisions, and fit naturally into the rhythm of Mayberry without feeling like a temporary guest star. That difference was obvious to viewers, and it quickly became obvious to the writers as well. Over the next several seasons, Helen slowly became the most consistent, most important woman in Andy Taylor's fictional life. The show even built an entire episode, titled The Rumor, around the town gossiping about whether Andy and Helen's relationship had finally gone public. It became one of the more memorable storylines of the series, precisely because audiences had been waiting years to see whether the sheriff would ever actually commit to someone. On screen, it was adorable, slow burn, small-town romance, and it existed inside a show that felt like one big family. Frances Bavier played Aunt Bee, the widowed sheriff's doting housekeeper, and Ron Howard, still just a child, played Opie with a warmth that made him one of the most beloved young actors on television. Griffith reportedly grew genuinely close to Howard off-screen, close enough that some who worked on the set said the bond between the two felt more like father and son than actor and co-star. It's part of what made the show's wholesome reputation so convincing. Everyone involved seemed to genuinely like each other. But according to people who worked alongside them, something far messier was unfolding once the cameras stopped rolling between two of that same close-knit cast. So what was really going on between takes? The open secret on set. According to the 2015 book Andy and Don, The Making of a Friendship and a Classic American TV Show by author Daniel Devisay, the connection between Griffith and Corsaut didn't stay fictional. Devisay's research, drawn from interviews with people who worked on the show, describes an ongoing relationship between the two stars that lasted throughout their 5 years filming together, one that crew members widely treated as an open secret rather than a wild rumor. At the time, Griffith was married to his first wife, Barbara Bray Edwards, and the couple had adopted 2 children together, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr. and Dixie Nan Griffith. Griffith and Barbara had actually married back in 1949, long before either of them had any idea he'd become one of the most recognizable faces on American television. By the time Corsaut arrived on set in 1963, the marriage had already lasted over a decade. According to Devisay's account, Griffith reportedly proposed to Corsaut on more than one occasion, despite being a married man. Devisay wrote that Andy couldn't get enough of Aneta, describing a pull between the two that neither of them seemed able to shake for the better part of 5 years. Corsaut, according to the same reporting, turned him down every time. And according to later interviews Corsaut gave, she hinted at the proposals herself, without ever confirming exactly how many times he'd asked. It gets even more dramatic. Multiple retellings of the story describe an incident where a young crew member decided to play a prank on the two stars. He allegedly dressed up as a writer and delivered dinner to a Hollywood hotel room where the pair had reportedly slipped away together. When Griffith realized what had happened, he was said to be furious, which only confirmed to onlookers that there was, in fact, something worth hiding. It's the kind of story that sounds almost too perfectly scripted for a show about small-town secrets, and yet, by every account, it really happened. What makes the story especially striking is the timeline involved. Corsaut joined the cast in 1963 and stayed through the show's final season in 1968, which means the alleged relationship, according to Devisay's reporting, ran alongside the entire back half of the show's original run. That's 5 consecutive years of filming a wholesome family sitcom by day, then reportedly carrying on a secret relationship once the cameras stopped. Crew members who spoke to Devisay described a set where everyone seemed to know, and everyone seemed to have quietly agreed not to say anything, a kind of unspoken code that Hollywood insiders of that era were famous for keeping. That kind of silence wasn't unusual in Hollywood during the 1960s. Studios still had enormous influence over the public image of their stars, and personal scandals were often handled quietly rather than splashed across newspaper headlines. Cast and crew understood that protecting a successful television series meant protecting the people at its center. Whether out of loyalty, fear of losing their jobs, or simple respect for personal privacy, very few people had any reason to speak publicly while the show was still on the air. It helps explain how rumors that reportedly circulated behind the scenes never reached the millions of viewers watching every week. To be clear, neither Griffith nor Corsaut ever publicly confirmed a romantic relationship while they were alive. Neither one addressed it in interviews, and neither left behind a memoir or diary that spelled things out in their own words. This is a case where the loudest confirmation came only after both stars had passed away, through the people who spent years standing just off camera, watching two of the most recognizable faces on American television try to hide something in plain sight. So, if neither star ever admitted it themselves, how did this story ever get out? For decades, the alleged affair stayed exactly where Hollywood secrets usually stay. Whispered about, never printed, protected by an entire industry that knew how to keep its mouth shut. Both Griffith and Corsaut carried their side of the story to their graves without ever addressing it directly. It wasn't until Devise's book that former crew members and colleagues began speaking on the record about what they claimed to have witnessed for years. Their accounts describe a private relationship that was tender in some moments and reckless in others, playing out in hotel rooms and on set, hidden in plain sight from a television audience that had no idea their favorite sheriff was living a double life. Some outlets covering the story since have been careful to note it was never definitively proven, and both stars are gone, so neither can confirm or deny it themselves. But the volume and consistency of insider accounts is exactly why the story has refused to die more than a decade after Griffith's passing. Multiple entertainment outlets have since republished and re-reported the claims from Devise's book, each time framing it a little differently, some leaning into the romance angle, others treating it more like a cautionary tale about the price of fame. What's stayed consistent across nearly every retelling is the core claim. This wasn't a single rumor from a single source, but a pattern described by several people who were actually there. If it really was going on, what did it end up costing him? The marriage that didn't survive. Griffith and Barbara Bray Edwards had been married since 1949, long before Mayberry, back when Griffith was still building a career as a stage performer and comedy recording artist in North Carolina. Barbara had been there for the early, uncertain years, and together they adopted their two children, Sam and Dixie, building a family life that largely stayed out of the public eye even as Griffith's fame exploded. Their marriage finally ended in divorce in 1972, several years after The Andy Griffith Show had wrapped production. By most accounts, the marriage had been strained for years before that, and the timing, coming not long after the alleged affair with Corsaut, had reportedly run its course, only fueled speculation about what had really pushed the couple apart. Griffith moved on quickly, marrying Greek actress Aneta Corsaut the following year, though that marriage was short-lived and ended within a few years. He would go on to marry a third time, to Cindy Knight, a marriage that lasted until his death nearly 3 decades later. Friends later described Cindy Knight as a calming influence during Griffith's later years. Unlike the intense spotlight that surrounded his Mayberry fame, their marriage was largely lived away from Hollywood, centered instead around their home in coastal North Carolina. Those who visited Griffith in retirement often remarked that he seemed happiest when he was fishing, spending time with close friends, or enjoying the quiet life he'd spent decades trying to protect. As for Corsaut, she never married at all. She remained single for the rest of her life and had no children. Reports from those who knew her describe her as intensely private about her personal life, someone who kept people at arm's length, even while starring alongside Griffith for years on 2 separate shows. Whatever happened between them behind closed doors, she carried it with her in silence until the day she died, never once addressing the rumors publicly. even decades after the cameras had stopped rolling. With the affair reportedly behind them and the show over, both stars still had entire careers left to build. So what did life look like for Andy Griffith once he hung up his sheriff's badge for good? Life after Mayberry. After leaving The Andy Griffith Show, Griffith bounced through a few short-lived projects, including Headmaster and The New Andy Griffith Show, neither of which came close to matching his earlier success. Then in 1983, his life took a frightening turn when he was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune condition that attacks the nervous system and left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors weren't initially sure he would walk again. He spent 7 grueling months in rehabilitation, relearning how to move his own legs, a private battle that stood in stark contrast to the confident, easygoing sheriff audience remembered him as. He returned to television in 1986 as the title character in Matlock, a courtroom drama that ran for 9 seasons and introduced him to an entirely new generation of fans who had never watched a single episode set in Mayberry. The comeback was even more remarkable given how close he had come, just a few years earlier, to never working again. Griffith later said publicly that the illness forced him to rebuild not just his physical strength, but his confidence, and that returning to steady, demanding television work felt like proof to himself that he'd actually recovered. Playing folksy defense attorney Ben Matlock, Griffith once again became one of the most trusted faces on American television, proving that his appeal never really depended on the sheriff's badge in the first place. In a twist that feels almost too fitting, Aneta Corsaut guest-starred on 9 episodes of Matlock as Judge Cynthia Justin, meaning the two on-screen lovers found their way back to working together decades after Mayberry. This time as a defense attorney and a judge rather than a sheriff and a schoolteacher. What made Matlock even more remarkable was that it proved Griffith wasn't simply living off nostalgia. By the mid-80s, television had changed dramatically, yet audiences embraced him all over again. Younger viewers who had never watched The Andy Griffith Show knew him only as the sharp-witted attorney who always seemed one step ahead of the prosecution. Critics often pointed out that Ben Matlock shared many of the same qualities as Andy Taylor. He was calm under pressure, quietly observant, and relied on common sense instead of theatrics. In many ways, Griffith had managed to reinvent himself without abandoning the qualities that had made him famous in the first place. Griffith's career earned him serious institutional respect along the way. He received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1976, and his portrayal of Andy Taylor was later ranked among the greatest TV dads in television history by TV Guide. In 2005, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest civilian honors in the country, recognizing decades of work that had shaped how American audiences thought about small-town life, law enforcement, and family values. He kept working well into his 80s, taking his final acting role in a 2009 stage play before retiring from performing altogether at age 83. His on-screen partner in Scandal wasn't as fortunate when it came to time. So what ultimately happened to Aneta Corsaut? The woman who kept the secret. Aneta Corsaut passed away on November 6, 1995, from cancer, just 3 days after her 62nd birthday. She was laid to rest at Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. In the years after The Andy Griffith Show, she continued working steadily, taking roles in shows like The Blue Knight and Adam 12, and even briefly stepping into the soap opera General Hospital to cover for an ill cast member. She also co-authored a book called The Mystery Reader's Quiz Book, a project that showed off a side of her far removed from Mayberry. Friends and colleagues who spoke about her after her death consistently described the same thing: a deeply private woman who rarely discussed her personal life, even with people she worked with for years. If she carried any regret or any lingering feelings for Griffith, she never said so publicly. Corsaut had studied acting seriously, training with the famous acting coach Lee Strasberg and majoring in drama at Northwestern University. And by most accounts, she saw herself as a working actress first, someone who didn't want a real-life scandal defining a career she'd worked hard to build. Whatever truth existed between them went into the ground with her, leaving future biographers and former crew members to fill in the gaps decades later. Griffith had nearly 2 more decades left to live after Corsaut's death. So how did the man behind Mayberry's most trusted sheriff spend his final years? And how did the world respond when he was finally gone? Griffith didn't fade quietly into retirement after Matlock ended in 1995. He kept a surprisingly active public life well into his 80s, even as his health began to catch up with him behind the scenes. In 2000, he suffered a heart attack that led to quadruple heart bypass surgery at a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, a serious procedure for a man already in his 70s. 7 years later, in 2007, he underwent hip surgery after a fall. Another sign that the easygoing sheriff audiences remembered was, by then, a genuinely elderly man dealing with real physical decline. None of it stopped him from working. That same year, he appeared in the independent film Waitress, and the following year he showed up in country singer Brad Paisley's award-winning music video, Waitin' on a Woman. In 1997, he even won a Grammy Award for his gospel album I Love to Tell the Story, 25 Timeless Hymns, a project that had nothing to do with Mayberry or Matlock, and everything to do with his North Carolina roots. Griffith also became an unexpectedly influential voice in North Carolina politics during these later years. In 2000, he appeared in a last-minute campaign commercial endorsing a gubernatorial candidate, and observers credited his endorsement with helping turn around a race that had been slipping away. He went on to endorse other Democratic candidates for governor, and even appeared alongside his former on-screen son, Ron Howard, in an online video supporting Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008. In 1997, a museum dedicated to Griffith's life and career opened in his hometown of Mount Airy, eventually growing into a 2,500-square-foot facility holding what's described as the world's largest collection of Griffith memorabilia. Through all of it, Griffith stayed guarded about his personal life, the same way he had been since his Mayberry days. Friends who knew him in Manteo described a man who protected his privacy fiercely, someone who could vanish into his own small community despite being one of the most recognizable faces in America. It's the same instinct for secrecy, some have pointed out, that may have helped him keep an entire love affair hidden for the better part of 5 years without the public ever catching on. Griffith had nearly 2 more decades left to live after Corsaut's death. So how did the man behind Mayberry's most trusted sheriff spend his final years? And how did the world respond when he was finally gone? Andy Griffith died on July 3, 2012, at his home in Manteo, North Carolina, at the age of 86, following a heart attack the day before. His death certificate listed hypertension, coronary artery disease, and high cholesterol as underlying conditions. In keeping with arrangements he had made long before, there was no public funeral. Griffith was buried in the Griffith family cemetery on Roanoke Island within just 5 hours of his death, a burial so quick and quiet that many fans didn't even learn he had died until after he was already laid to rest. Tributes poured in from across the entertainment industry and from the political world, a reflection of just how deeply Sheriff Andy Taylor had embedded himself into American culture over 5 decades. But death didn't end the story. If anything, It opened the door for the people who had stayed quiet for years to finally start talking. 3 years after Griffith passed, Devise's book hit shelves and pulled back the curtain on exactly what insiders claimed had been happening on that set all along. Suddenly, the wholesome sheriff who never lied had a real, well-documented rumor attached to his name, one that came directly from the people who spent years standing beside him. It's a strange kind of ending. Andy Griffith spent his entire career playing a man defined by honesty. And yet, the most human, complicated part of his real life only became public once he could no longer speak for himself. Whether you see it as a tragic love story or a betrayal hiding behind a badge, the truth is that Mayberry was never quite as simple as it looked on screen. Andy Griffith gave America one of its most beloved characters, a man who never lied, never cheated, and never let his town down. But the man underneath the uniform was reportedly far more complicated than Sheriff Andy Taylor ever let on, carrying a secret for decades that only came out once he and the woman at the center of it were both gone. It's worth remembering just how carefully Griffith guarded every part of his private life, not only the alleged affair with Corsaut, but his health struggles, his 3 marriages, and even something as simple as where he actually lived in Manteo. For a man whose entire career was built on seeming like an open book, he spent his real life doing everything he could to stay closed. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Even the most trustworthy face on television was, according to those who knew him best, hiding a story nobody saw coming. Andy Griffith spent his entire career playing a man defined by honesty, and it turns out the most human, complicated part of his life only became public once he could no longer speak for himself. So the next time you watch reruns of Mayberry, and Andy Taylor gives Helen Crump that familiar easy smile, remember there might have been a lot more going on behind that smile than anyone in Mayberry or anyone watching at home ever realized.